let me tell you why we're on this topic. Really, there's a couple of reasons. One, we're in the family series. Grandparents fits very well in that. Reason number one is because chances are, if you're not one, you will be one. There may be a few exceptions, but chances are, if you're not that, you'll be a great aunt or a great uncle, and it's kind of the same thing, or great-great-grandmother or something to that effect. Second reason is because it is a calling for the godly. If you are following God, there is a special call for the grandparent or those removed at least one generation. And it's nothing new. It goes back, if we look at Deuteronomy 4:9, and as Chris shared on your guides, what's highlighted, what's there, it makes it very easy to follow along with what we're talking about. Deuteronomy says, "Only take heed to yourself and diligently keep yourselves, lest you forget the things your eyes have seen, and lest they depart from your heart all the days of your life, and teach them to your children and your," guess what? Grandchildren. Proverbs 13:22 says, "A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children." So reason two is it's a God's calling. Reason three deals with a promise, and we're going to save that one to the very end. So let's kick in a bit, and I just want to give you kind of a backstory how we got where we are and how we're talking about this today. We're following loosely a series that we've picked up from another church, at least on topics, and so we start by looking at what they said, and then, of course, in our own research, alter usually quite drastically to fit our own needs. And I found when I was doing this grandparent thing, I was really quite surprised. I'd say there was even a certain phenomenon in this. It started when I looked at the material that I first had, and it was all biblically correct. Nothing wrong with it at all that way. But as I was telling the first crowd, I got to tell every congregation, because I know I look like I'm 25 or so, but Ashley's nodding, so it's true. But I'm really a grandparent, and so as I'm reading the sermon and the information as a grandparent, I'm going, it's true, biblically, this is right, but it didn't touch me at all. I said, I don't feel I'm gaining anything by looking at this. And so, excuse me, that's a grandparent cough. I looked at other material, obviously, tons of material usually when we're preaching, we go through. And a lot of it, I found the same thing. I would look at the stuff, and it was biblically correct, but it didn't seem to pertain at all. And I wondered what was going on. Well, here's kind of why I'm thinking this way, is that if you look at the grandparenting situation in our day, we're dealing with this culture where one is families are decentralized. If your parents, as a young person today, are still together, you're probably the exception and not the rule. And then chances are, on top of that, your parents' are probably separated as well. So you have these decentralized families where you may be a set of grandparents, but just like one of five in this whole setup. Another way that things seem to go is this epidemic of estrangement. And there's all kinds of counseling for estranged grandparents. Things went south with the children, and then the children had children, and they want very little contact with the grandparents, and so there's this estrangement going on in that situation. And then we have grandparents in the exact opposite situation, is where somehow there was a large fail with the kids. We live in a culture now where the opioid epidemic, as well as other types of drugs, there's a lot of people falling to the wayside. And so the grandparents end up being the parents. All this stuff is kind of not the way it's meant to be, but the way it is. So grandparents are in quite a challenging situation in our culture. And something struck me that was interesting in all of this is that, you know what? I think that we are the first generation of grandparents living in a post-Christian culture. We're the first to be living in this particular situation, where it's officially a post-Christian culture. And we might feel like, oh man, here we are on new territory, but we're really not. In fact, we're on very old territory. I want you to think back in your Bible history a little bit, some 3,000 years, give or take, and think of another nation that said they were under God. And there is Israel, and it's after the time of Solomon, and these other kings are coming along, and things are degenerating spiritually. And to the point that we know the nation ultimately divides in two, and then ultimately is erased from the face of the earth by God's judgment for a time. But now put yourself back in that place. There you are as a grandparent. Maybe you grew up in the reign of Solomon. And now here's your grandchildren under this king who has said, forget it all. And you're remembering what it was like when the nation really followed God. And then, how do I grandparent? How do I do these things in that culture? We're not that far removed. Isn't it interesting? This generation of grandparents probably has the most in common with this generation of grandparents in the far distant past of Israel. So how do we deal with it? Well, not surprising then if we have so much in common that maybe for us grandparents to be grandparents, because I think it's only going to get more challenging as time goes on, how do we deal with it? Where do we look in Scripture? Not surprising, the Old Testament. And there is a passage on your guide sheets that, you know what, it wouldn't be bad to cut that one out and paste it to the fridge or your husband's forehead or something. And keep reading this as a grandparent psalm. Now, the psalm as a whole deals with a lot more other things, but these verses from 12 to 15, this is grandparent territory here. We read this. The righteous shall flourish like a palm tree. He shall grow like a cedar in Lebanon. Those who are planted in the house of the Lord shall flourish in the courts of our God. They shall still bear fruit in old age. They shall be fresh and flourishing, to declare that the Lord is upright. He is my rock, and there is no unrighteousness in him. This is one loaded passage for grandparents. Let's start, here's the strategy I'd like to go with. I'd like first of us to use a fancy name that people like Chris in college use. We'll exegete the text. We're going to pull some truths from that, but then let's apply them to the first grandparent generation living in the post-Christian culture. See what we can come up with. So let's get a little bit of the backstory and what was meant, because quite honestly, this is a side note for Bible study, but don't ever try and understand the truth of a text for you until you understand to some degree what the author originally meant. This is really a rabbit hole, but my thing is, imagine that God sent you a letter, your house was on fire. And you do this at a Bible study and you're all sitting there. Well, when God says my house is on fire, that means to me there is passion in the place, and you go off on some big explanation where in fact, I think I smell smoke. I think the intent of God was to tell me my house is on fire, get out. So it's good to understand the original intent and go from there. So what did the author mean as he's looking at, let's check some of these words. The operative ones are highlighted as usual on your sheet there. And start with the word righteous. Here we are in a culture that is still basically, it is under the law. How do you show God you love him? You follow his law, in this case the Mosaic law, the written law. Not surprising, in the Hebrew, the word righteous then means one who is lawful and just. One who has taken God himself seriously, is living by his word, is doing as best they can what they know God wants them to do. Wow, that's kind of timeless in itself, isn't it? And it says, as we look at who we're talking to, that's one, we're talking to the righteous. This is to the righteous. So whoever else is involved, this is dealing with the righteous. And it's something to note that as we go on, that it also says that these people take on the nature of God in itself. They're in God's inner circle. To be planted in the house, we read that in the verse, to be planted in the house. And that means to be part of the family. You know, we sing that song now, but that's an old song. It meant you were part of God's family back then. In the courts, anybody been to a third world country, especially, even in this day? Steve and I were reminiscing on this in Kenya. You know, you go to Kenya, especially Nairobi, every house has a wall around it, and then iron bars and a gate. And the reason being is, well, there's a lot of people who want to come in and take what you have, so you're set up for protection. So if you're allowed inside that wall, you're an inner circle person. That's somebody I can trust. I don't let just anybody inside the wall. And this is being allowed into the walled courtyard of God himself. So we're dealing with these righteous people. If you're looking for another definition of them, they are the people who are on the inner circle with God. They're in a close relationship. Lesson there that's timeless is, you know what? You can't be distant and righteous at the same time. You're one or the other. You cannot be distant and righteous at the same time. God is their rock. And the word that's used there really can mean a cliff. Well, that's nice. God is my rock. In fact, it means the precipice where you're on the edge. It can also mean a stone wall, because a stone wall has, clear edges on that. So, what's the author getting at here? Well, think of when you, have you ever gone anywhere, stood on a mountaintop or on a cliff edge, maybe hopefully not too close, but as you're looking, you can see things that other people can't. You can see a long way. If that stone wall is probably there for protection and you're standing on top of it, why do you have a guard up there? So they can see, so they can have a vantage point that no one else has. Put that all together. It's saying if God's your rock, he's your protection. He's the vantage point by which you see everything there is to see. And he's that substance, he's the bedrock on which you are standing. So the righteous have all of this going on. And then it says, we're looking at who's being addressed here. We know it's the righteous. We know it's these people who are counting on God, who have the attributes of God working in them. And then it says, those in old age. They just didn't pull punches in Hebrew. There's no senior citizens here or golden years. It's old age. And the exact meaning of the word is a head of gray, full of gray. So some of you guys who are balding quicker, you're not actually old because you don't have gray hair. There's just as guys with the gray hair. So we're talking righteous people who are later in life, who are all of these things we're talking about. But they're not your regular seniors. Let me just ask you, when we talk about seniors, when you think of somebody and you say, well, they're a senior citizen, or they're an older person or an old person, generally, we think of it as it naturally is. They tend to be more frail. They're not the fastest moving. They're probably, think of them kind of set in the ways. They're old timers. They can't use that cell phone like you can. All of those things. But it gives all of this stark contrast to what this type of senior is, this older person. It says, for one thing, that they're upright like palm trees. And then it says, it refers to them as the cedars of Lebanon. Well, what do those things mean? How does a palm tree grow? Well, it might have that classic little curve, but for the most part, it is a straight thing. And so a palm tree, in this regard, poetically speaking, was something that had some majesty to it, that had some uprightness to it, that had some stature. And of course, the cedars of Lebanon were like the sequoias we think of in our day. They were the mighty trees. Everybody was impressed with the cedars of Lebanon. These things and so they were the reference to strength and dignity. We don't always apply those to people who are simply older. And then it says this, they will bear fruit. And depending on your translation, it might say something like, They are sap running and green. Well, that doesn't sound too good, does it? But what it's talking about is, if you have something more modern, fresh and flourishing. They are actually alive and vital like a young tree. They're still producing fruit, even though we've just said they're in their old age. But the righteous person is all those things. Well, that's not natural for an older person to be those things, but it can be supernatural. It can be a supernatural thing. And then it says that these righteous people have a reason for being here. There is a mission, and it was to declare that the Lord is upright. Now, I just want you to consider some words here, a little nuance. There's the word righteous used a few times, and that word righteous refers to a moral standing, doesn't it? If I say someone is righteous, you think they're right in their morals, they follow them, they do what they say they'll do. But upright, especially in this language, can be a little bit different. It can mean righteous, as in being upright in your morals, but it can also mean straight or level or correct, straightforward, fitting, proper, or pleasing. And you're to declare that God is those things. Now, the word declare in the God means to show, to tell, to report, to expound, to avow, to acknowledge, to confess, or to be the messenger of it. I want you to think of these words. Now, let's just say I'm just going to pick someone at random here. I'm just going to say Jack. Somebody asked me what kind of guy Jack is, and I say Jack is an upright man. Jack is someone that is level. He is. You ask him something, he'll say the correct thing. He's proper. He's appropriate. How do you know that about Jack? Did I read a book about Jack? No, because I had a relationship and I have seen these things. These are words from experience. Let me go on and say, well, how do you declare? How do you nagad? How do you show? How do you report, acknowledge, confess something? Firsthand experience. I can't acknowledge, I can't avow that Jack is those things if I've never met him firsthand. I can't confess that these things are the way he is. So you get what's going on here with these people in age. What is the thing that us as older people, those of us who are, and even you who aren't so old yet, what is the thing we have that younger people do not have? It starts with this: we have time. Is that they have simply not been on this earth as long as you have. And if you are righteous, according to what we're reading, that means you have been walking with the Lord longer than they have. And that means there are things in experience that you can confess, avow, show, that they may believe, but they have not experienced them. They have not had the time to experience them as long as you have. The one thing that we have is time under our belt. Now, let me go back to last week. We were talking about the parents. The big analogy was the race. If you remember, we were running the race up there. And so we said this about parents. This was a takeaway for parents. They were to equip their children for the race, which of course was life. To equip their children for the race. And not only were they to equip them, we looked at a race, that a race doesn't matter how well you run it, really, until the finish line. So we were to equip them as best we can to run the race well to the very end. And we said the biggest tool that the parent has in their faith is authenticity. If you're not the real deal, why should your child listen to you? Well, I heard God is good. Well, that's nice, but show me, right? And that's where the grandparent comes in, because the grandparent is the person who has the time. And, sure, I hate to say it this way, but it's true that if we've lived a long time, we're closer to the finish line than our grandchildren are, hopefully. And so if we are the real deal, if we are authentic, our place is to show. Our place, then, is to show what it looks like for the authentic Christian to run the race well to the end. we're supposed to show our grandchildren what that looks like. So, okay, how do we do that? We just said we're living in a post-Christian, postmodern as well, which is just as bad, culture. How do we as grandparents then do this? Well, I'm going to pull us back. I'm just going to offer you 3 things that I think are timeless and they'll apply everywhere. Because let's face it, at this point, there's a lot of us in a lot of different situations. We have some healthy grandparent situations. We have some that are just terrible in that they're in situation where they're estranged. Others on the other end that they're not estranged, but they're saddled back to be parents when they should just be grandparents. So what can fit across the universal of all this stuff, no matter where we are? Start with this. Be the image of God's righteousness. Grow in grace with grace. Grow in grace with grace. The whole idea is we're supposed to be looking more and more like God. And even if we live to be 150, the truth is you're still a child to God, right? So there's always room to grow. There's always room to grow. So we should still be growing in our faith. We are still flourishing. We still can flourish. We don't know everything there is to know. There's always something more, a way to be deepened in this. So we grow in grace, but we grow with grace as well. Here's one thing to keep in mind. If there is a faux pas for grandparents, and I'm saying not in the exceptional cases, but in the normal case, if there's a faux pas for grandparents, it's trying to be the parent. It's like being the backseat driver. You know, it's the parent's job to be the parent, not the grandparent. We have another part in all of this. As a parent, it's their job to teach and discipline and to teach discipline to their children. We can reinforce, but it's not our job to be the parent. It's their job to do that type of thing. The 2 greatest tools, I think, that God has given the grandparent are 2 timeless qualities of himself. And those 2 qualities are forgiveness and love. Forgiveness and love. Growing with grace. What does grace mean in the Christian context? Ever know that? The standard definition is unmerited favor, isn't it? Unmerited favor. God showing favor to us that we do not deserve. And if there is an honest grandparent out there, just imagine if we came in here and we could watch, your worst moments in life. Boy, I wouldn't want anybody to see that movie on me. So, there's probably not a mistake that kids would make today in some form that I probably haven't done myself in some way, some level. But God has forgiven me. God has allowed me to walk with him all this time. And I am called to show that same forgiveness to the people walking alongside me and those coming up behind me, even those before me. I am called. Think of this as at our age, for us grandparents out there, if we haven't learned the grace of forgiveness from us to others by now, when will we learn it? Quite frankly, we're starting to run out of time there, aren't we? The idea that we forgive because God forgave us and he forgives us as we forgive others. Seems to me I read that somewhere in the Lord's Prayer. We are called to forgive. And boy, forgiveness, no matter if you're dealing with the worst situation that a grandparent can be into to the very best, forgiveness will play a vital part in there. Love is the other one. You know why kids love their grandparents? Is because, no matter what they do, they're accepted for who they are and what they are. It's not that we should be indulging or underwriting their discipline or dignity or whatever. It's just that grandparents just love kids. We love our grandkids. Get your phone full of your grandkids, right? And your cats, of course. But grandkids are still number one. Unconditional love. That is maybe the super weapon, the secret weapon in there. But let me say that's love according to God's idea of love. love of our grandkids doesn't mean us, that's okay no matter what you do. And it's not, come on over and I'll spoil you and, tell me everything your parents don't want you to eat and I'll give it to you right now. That's not what it is. 1 Corinthians 13 tells us what love really is. Love is patient. That can be tricky for grandparents. Love is kind. It's not envious. Love does not brag. It is not puffed up. It is not rude. It is not self-serving. Wow, it's amazing. There are actually articles out there that for parents how to deal with their narcissistic grandparents. Isn't it a shame when we have reached a point where we need that? Love is not rude. It's not easily angered. It's not resentful. How might that fit into your grandparenting? It's not glad about injustice, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. And as Paul is telling us all about this, it ends with love never ends. And now these three remain. These three remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. The greatest that remains is love. Above all, God's quality of love shown, grown in grace with grace, because even love has its own form of dignity. Be the image of God, the wisdom of the ages in childlike wrapping. The wisdom of the ages in childlike wrapping. What do you mean? Well, let's start with this, that childlike and childish are not the same thing, okay? And yeah, it's true. We get older, we can get childish. But childlike, what am I talking about? Matthew 18, 3 through 5. Jesus he's trying to tell people something that's very important. And he says this: assuredly, I say to you, unless you are converted, so there's the godly part of it, and become as little children. To be converted is to become as little children. You will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever receives one little child like this in my name receives me. Called to receive children, but to be like children. Now, we put this in context. We know we're not talking every trait that a child has. We're talking in the positive here, so the positive traits. So just stop for a moment yourself and think of it. What would we call these almost universal, probably, positive traits of children? What things are just straight out positive? Well, the word straightforward was part of a definition we looked at. That's the great things about kids. They'll just tell you, not maliciously, but they'll just tell you like it is. And when I think of kids telling it like it is, oh man, I'm just full of stories. I'm saying I loved, if you remember, many of us still friends with Carol Fitzgerald, and her granddaughter went off to visit Harold and Thelma Lisby when Harold was still a young man of about 99. And they were visiting, and Carol was being all gracious and everything to visit. And then Harold and Thelma were easy to love, and they were easy to talk to because they were childlike. They would talk to you more like a peer than, talk down on you, even for a 10-year-old granddaughter. And this 10-year-old girl just had a whale of a time dealing with Harold. And so as they're leaving, she turns and says, "Harold, you're the oldest friend I know." And meanwhile, Carol's dying, but Harold's chuckling and did for a week because it was just straightforward. It's true. At 10 years old, if you have a friend of 99, they probably are the oldest friend you have. And that's just as much fun as anything. But they are straightforward. That can be very refreshing. Children are naturally trusting. Children trust unless they're taught otherwise. Children are by far innocent unless that's stolen from them. Children by nature are full of hope. Children by nature are full of wonder and potential. Who is it that says, when I grow up, I want to be such and such? And usually they're the biggest dreams as they're young, and then they kind of scale down as they get older. But the fact is that children are full of wonder and potential. And it's saying that this Psalm 92 is telling us that all these attributes of the young will be in the righteous old, and so they can connect. And the old can do what they're called to do, not because they are naturally that way, but because they are supernaturally that way. Hopefully, in natural sense, taking care of their health is best in everything. But all these qualities of God come supernaturally, not naturally. And there is a certain twist. We know that a child is innocent because they haven't experienced the bad yet. For us, it's a more profound. If you are the righteous grandparent, you are still innocent, not because you haven't experienced the world, maybe even some of the worst of the world, but you choose the good and not the bad. That is real innocence. And we have that to share with them. We can see through the wonder of their eyes. We can be patient with them when they talk too much and ask too many questions. And the word why comes up for the 95th time in your conversation. We can be kind. We can be not self-serving or resentful of trying to deal with them. We can be all of these things. We can be these childlike things, but wrapped up in all the wisdom and all the time that we have gathered with God. We are like God in wisdom, but childlike in our approach. We can be the image of God to the end. We can stay on mission by declaring. Stay on mission. Whether you're estranged, whether you're physically a long ways away, maybe it's not easy to see the grandkids that often, but we can still be the face of God when they do see us. And I mean authentically, as the context we were talking about. Here is the mission we were giving: to declare that God is upright. We already determined that word upright is one of firsthand experience. I know God is upright because I've walked with the uprightness of God. We are called to let our children know what that's like, to show them what is it we are called to do, to declare the uprightness of God. So we look at it all together, and it said that it ends with a promise. If we do this as best we can, no matter what our situation is at the present as grandparents, we can only start where we are. But there is a promise, the way it's supposed to be. I want to give you one last passage that has some incredible words to it. Proverbs 17:6 says this: "Children's children are a crown to the aged, and the parents are the pride of their children." Children's children are a crown to the aged, and parents are the pride of their children. The idea of being a crown, that's not too hard for us grandparents to understand. But let me just, quick word study. Children's children can mean grandchildren. It can also mean children, or it can mean youth in general. See, I pointed out when we were in the first class, I mentioned, I said, you look at the teachers were sitting out there. I said, you know what? When you teachers go into the classroom, these other children are going to go in your classroom, and for that half hour, whatever they are in there, those children are your children. They are your children. For people in a grandparent age, it's the same thing. If children are in here, they are our grandchildren. We still have that role to play even in their lives. And it was interesting, isn't it? The first part of that sounds like it's talking about grandparents and then parents, but the word parent there actually can mean father, grandfather, forefather, or founder of a household. But the word that's really nice is the word that they are the pride of their children. That word, tifara, it means beauty, finery, or the attribute of God. And guess what? It brings us back to where we started. And if you had two takeaways with this today, I would say grandparent or yet to be one. The first is this: we're on new ground that's very old. You are the first generation of grandparent in a post-Christian culture, and it has challenges. But the answers are timeless. And the second thing is this, is that what are you called? You are called to show what it looks like when the authentic person finishes well. You and I are called to show our grandchildren what it looks like when the godly cross the finish line. That is our main job as grandparents, is to finish well.
The righteous shall flourish like a palm tree. The interesting thing about that is when they flourish like a palm tree, as Pastor Kevin said, they shall grow straight. They shall grow strong. If you think about it, the seed has the promise of a perfect tree. Every seed has that promise. And so what could cause a tree not to grow to that promise? And that is the environmental conditions. And so what we're talking about today is what it means to be in family with Jesus Christ, what it means to be someone who can change the environmental damage that can be done if we do not step up into their lives. So Lord, I pray today as we all go out, that once again you will give us a vision, you will give us the gifts, and you will give us the wisdom to speak into the lives of others so that they may know who you are.